I didn't put a description, but they'll figure it out. It's Zoom that I want. Okay, I'm going to start the recording in a moment. Is everybody cool? Ready to begin? Okay. Thank you for bearing with us. This is too exciting. But we are now recording this epic session, book signing, our very first in-person, I don't know which camera, I'm like looking all around, our first in-person and virtual event. So we've got Facebook, thank you for joining us. We have Zoom, we are recording, and we have a wonderful group of in-person guests. My name is Nzinga. Welcome to Afriware Books Company. We pride ourselves on providing a platform for authors, artists, and advocates that instill us with a sense of cultural pride. We are in our 30th year in business come August 15th, and extremely excited to carry on this legacy into the next generation. Today's event is a book signing with Brother Joshua Myers, author of Black Study. I was like, wait a minute, too many ofs, right? And I was so happy a few weeks ago to be sent an email by Muriel Bala of the Kemetic Institute asking if we could co-sponsor this event. And of course I had to say yes. I was like, okay, now our normal process is to review the book, but but I certainly respect the institution of the Kemetic Institute and was willing to yield to your review, and I know I am not going to be disappointed. Any book that has Jacob Crothers' name in it, okay, has got to build out some important concepts that we need to learn about. Would you like to share a few words? We can give you a mic. We'll give you a mic so everybody can hear. There we go.
Okay.
I can change.
Yem Hotep, which means welcome in Medu-Neter, the language of ancient Egypt, or Kemet, as our ancestors called it. This is my second time introducing Josh Myers. The first time was probably about 20 years ago, or close to 20 years ago, and he was in the PhD program at Temple University, and that was, I think we met at that same moment.
Wow.
I am a member of the Kemetic Institute, and our founding director is Jacob Crothers, who is Josh Myers' book of Black Study focuses on Black thinkers who have worked to liberate Black intellectualism, Black thinking, Black study, and Black thought from the manipulation of the Western intellectual standards. And Jacob Crothers believed that it was through founding of institutions that we could just expand on that work and, pass it on to others. He was the founding director of the Kemetic Institute. Harold, sitting to my right are Harold Moses Robinson and Simpson Robinson, who were longtime members of the Kemetic Institute, who welcomed me into the organization when I came in 1986. And we worked together in both the Kemetic Institute and in the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations for many years. That was the association, or Appt. It's another organization that Robert Jacob Carruthers was institutional in founding. What Josh is doing is promoting these thinkers' ideas to new generations and to some older generations that didn't happen to be familiar with them. So we really appreciate all your work, Josh.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I don't know if I should be using the microphone or not.
We're close to the so each device has its microphone, so we're close.
So we're close.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll turn this on. Okay. Thank you, Josh / electrical engineer. We are gifting him that title as well today. So all kinds of gifts are coming out today. I just want to read the back of the book as a formal introduction and allow you time to, stretch out how you wish to. Inspiration, how you got started, whatever way you're led to share is definitely welcome. And then we want to invite the studio audience to feel free to gather your thoughts, to ask any questions that you might have. We will have an opportunity for Q&A, and we will end. We were going to end, 3:30, but basically by 4 o'clock we got to be out of here. Okay. We're gonna shut everything down. So Joshua Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Howard University. He is the author of Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition, and We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of the Howard University Protest of 1989. Please put your hands together for Brother Joshua Myers.
Thank you all.
Yes.
It's first and foremost important to say that, the best of our work follows our ancestors, who are always in front of us, right? In many of our spiritual traditions, we believe that we are not, going forward as much as we're going towards our ancestors. And in a literal sense, one of the reasons that I was excited to come to Afriware is that Muriel told me that this is where Jacob Carruthers and many other scholars in our tradition came to launch their books. And so it's only appropriate to be here. And I want to thank Sister Nzinga for making the space available without reviewing the book for trusting us, for trusting the tradition, for trusting our intellectual genealogy enough to invite us, and of course thank our Sister Muriel for the idea. So it wasn't quite 20 years. I was still in high school 20 years ago. But when you said that, it made me actually think about, what was the actual date? And I think it was 2010. When we were in Kent is when you first introduced the panel that I was on. And I was a grad student at Suburb. 2010. Oh no, 2011 we were in Kent. Whatever year, one of those years.
I didn't realize it.
2011 or 2012, yeah. Actually, Howard was 2011. 2012 was Kent. And then we came back to Howard in 2013 for ASCAP. And I think he may have even put me to work at the registration table one of those years. There was something.
I thought you volunteered.
We had we had to check badges. That's what you had me doing.
Wow.
Conferences. Oh boy. So yeah, it's great to be back. I was saying last night we were actually here, 2019, actually 2020, in Chicago. That is, the last time I was here for the Jacob Carruthers conference, and I also had my first book at Seminary Co-op, we were fighting for. And so that was the last time I've physically been in Chicago, but there's been a whole lot of virtual meetings with Chicago folk and Chicago conferences, including Comedic Institute, of course, and also the University of Chicago. And they were trying to figure out what they wanted to do in the wake of the 2020 moment, which is like very interesting for us now in Black Studies, because all of a sudden universities decided that we were valuable as a certain kind of intellectual space that doesn't really look like what we want Black Studies to be. And so a lot of the money that flowed after that moment was very interesting, that, you know, this is white folks' reactions to fund anti-racism research, whatever that means. And the other part about it, which is still hilarious to me, they flooded Black, I don't know if this happened to Afriware, but they flooded Black bookstores with orders.
They did.
Of Robin DiAngelo's books and Ibram Kendi's. It was like,
Yes,
wait a
they
minute.
did.
There's also this other stuff that y'all wanted to really read. You could actually read it, right? And then they didn't pick up the books, let alone read them. And so I kind of see university administration playing the same kind of game with us. And that's not just at any single institution, but across the board. When anti-racism became a buzzword in 2020, there was funds available. And with neoliberal higher education, when funds are available, they try to fit what they already do into the landscape. And so they assumed Black Studies was anti-racism research. And so that's not the impetus for this book. I had long started this book, but it's certainly a contextual sort of moment, because when it became clear that I was not writing a book about anti-racism, it was like, all right, so where are you going to publish this, or who's going to read this, right? Because so much of the energy around anti-racism then translates into the university version of that, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. For those who remember the early 90s, this is just multiculturalism 2.0, which, of course, Jacob Carruthers roundly criticized in that time. And so, if Black Studies isn't anti-racism research, and if it's not multiculturalism 2.0, DEI, then what is it? And so that's what this book seeks to begin to answer, but by first going back to several moments. The moment that we have to reckon with, and I was hoping, I don't know if Carmen was a student that came by yesterday, but I was hoping that Carmen would be here. She's a PhD student at Northwestern. And she came to Northwestern she's from Chicago, but she came to Northwestern through her PhD so that she could study the history of the Black Studies movement. And so we have to return to that moment. Martha Biondi teaches at Northwestern, author of a book called The Black Revolution on Campus. And in that book, you know, there's this idea that, you know, these are the students of Malcolm X, or who are inspired by Malcolm X, SNCC, African Liberation Support Committee, this moment in the late 1960s where there's this very clear turn towards kind of Black identity that's not necessarily rendered as pathological, that's not necessarily rendered as inferior, that in fact, you know, is the foundation and grounds from which we might read the world, but also participate in ongoing revolution. Like, it was always about revolution. And so if we're going to be Black students in these higher education institutions, then our relationship is with the community and with the revolutionary movements that are happening around the If we don't have an education that's tied to that, we don't have an education. That was the impulse of Black Studies in this initial moment. And so that's very different from, well, how does it feel to be a problem research, right? It's very different from racial disparity research, right? It's very different from the self-confessional, no, I have to note my privilege kind of research, right? And because of that difference, the peoples who are now talking about or centering questions of revolution and socialism and all the things that are really also abolition, of course, Chicago is a huge city for that question, are doing so without first centering that Black folk have always been about these things, right? And so they're going through other traditions to get to things like abolition, to get to things. And not everybody's doing this, but there's certainly a group that is very loud on social media that does this, right? Right? We invented abolition yesterday, right? And, part of what we have to do is not only return to these roots, just give you one quick example. And, this is really important because Cedric Robinson never claimed to have invented anything. But in 1971, when Angela Davis was in jail, he taught a course on abolition that was centered around this notion of abolition, right? And so if you return to these archives of what we were doing in that period, we realized that there's nothing new under the sun. And they would say, you have to go back even further, right? And so Cedric Robinson occupies a chapter in this book for that reason. But who else occupies a chapter in this book? W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Du Bois said in the 1930s, well, you can't understand the notion of race and class and the debates around race and class that are happening unless you go back to the Reconstruction period. And so he writes his book, Black Reconstruction in America, and he says, well, look here, look what happened. Africans decided that they were going to walk off the plantations. And everything changed after that. The meaning of the Civil War changed. Abraham Lincoln's tactics and strategies changed, right? The Confederate response even has to undergo a shift, right? But more than that, he asked an even more significant question, and that is, what did Black people think they were doing when they walked off the plantation? And so I have a section about that in this particular book, and I use the subtitle from the words that Du Bois used to describe the intent and meaning behind Black liberation struggle during this Reconstruction period. And that was, to Black folk, to Black people, freedom was God. Now, why did Du Bois say that? Seems to me that we might need to understand a little bit about what Jacob Carruthers would call the divine conversation to get at what Du Bois was meaning in that particular statement. In other words, what it meant to be free in this moment, what it meant to walk off this plantation, to live differently than we were living before. In some cases, enslaved Africans experienced greater hardship in the Union Army camps than they experienced on the plantations. But they still came, and they still decided that this was better than being enslaved. What did he mean by freedom was God? It meant that we had to believe in something larger than what existed in order to have the audacity to move. Freedom was not only God, freedom manifested in movement. And so in African cosmology, there's always this notion of going somewhere from somewhere else. Transition. Time is filled with swift transition. Right? Have you ever been to the rivers? Some of them may seem uncrossable. This movement, constant movement, that's the movement also of Africans like Harriet Tubman that decided, all right, it's time to go. It's time for us to go. And that movement, in fact, was inspired by the idea, not that we're going to be quote unquote free when we get somewhere, but the idea that in having the faith to move, God will do the rest. And so we hear that all the time, of course, in Black vernacular traditions, right? You just make the first step. God will do the rest. Du Bois captured that in 1935. And when he captured that, the historians didn't understand what he meant. But this is the same impulse that those students in the late 1960s had when they too decided it's time to go. They went into the institutions, transformed them, left them, decided that some were worth saving and some were worth creating anew, decided that we need alternative institutions too. And we did all of that in community, in collaboration with each other. And that's the moment, right? And that's the tradition that is being lost if we don't intentionally recover it. And it's not just about individuals, even though this book is about individuals, right? Each of these individuals that we wrote about were more concerned about the collective genius of African peoples. In fact, that was their methodology. It's not about great men or great women or great people as individuals. Their greatness is, in fact, as Ella Baker reminds us, is in the strength of the people. And so how do you have a conversation that allows us to bring that into broader view and into broader relief? Well, you need methods, unfortunately. But methods don't have to mean, a sage handbook on how to write Black. It doesn't have to mean that. It can mean the blues. And so what I do in my classrooms, which is deeply inspired by everything that I write, we talked about this last night, is this notion that these words have to perform the same role that spirituals perform. They have to perform the same role that the blues performs, right? Or else we can just discard the books, right? Why bother with books if books don't actually speak to our spirit, right? But one of the things I do in my classes is that we start from the thing that everybody already has access to. And I don't deal with the whole accessibility question, right? Because you're human. And if you're human, you already have something to bring to the table. What do you already have? And thankfully, I teach that in HBCU, right? All the challenges that represents. But at the very least, we still have Black students. I don't know how long that will last, but when you have Black students sitting in a circle like we do in this particular space, we have to know how to tap into what they already have. And the things that we already have are access to things like blues knowledge, right? And I talk about the blues a lot because the blues informs things that people don't even recognize as being informed by the blues, right? And so my students probably don't know Muddy Waters, but they do know Kendrick Lamar. And so I can start from Kendrick Lamar, get to Muddy Waters, and then get back to Black people, then we've done more work than most books can do. But then what happens, I give you a book called Blues People. And then it's like, all right, you want to know how to get from Muddy Waters to Kendrick Lamar and then back to Black people? Here's a method, Amiri Baraka, right? And so part of what the impulse is in like restoring this kind of moment that I'm talking about, where we didn't have it all figured out, but we were together in many respects, is to generate a method for these students to be able to access the thing that they already have, but have never been in an educational environment where that thing is not only centered, but pulled out of them. And so this is a book that thinks with people that do that. I think with W.E.B. Du Bois, as I previously mentioned, Cedric Robinson, as I previously mentioned, and of course Jacob Carruthers, the deep and enduring influence in terms of this whole thing about Africa, right? What is African about us? What is African about Africa? Right? I mean, it's so deep because so much of what Carruthers is able to do to set Africa on Africans' terms is so beyond the pale of what people think is possible within mainstream and or normative approaches to the study of Africa in the United States and global academy. In fact, the first event that I did with this book, I had a graduate student who was an Africanist being trained to be an African studies scholar. And he said, no, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to do now, because this is not what we get in African studies. And so he originally came to his own conclusion, which, I would have nudged him to, if he didn't. But he eventually came to the conclusion that, all right, I gotta wage intellectual warfare now. Everything has to be undone. Because I can't go, knowing what I know, right, because of Du Bois and corruption, knowing what I know, I can't allow the training that I'm being exposed to be my reality. And I think about that a lot because I felt the same way when I first read Jacob Carruthers as an undergrad at Howard University, and it's like, how can you be the same after this? And so one of the things that I really wanted to do in that chapter is explore, well, how did he become who he became? And so he has this statement that, again, another subject, chapter subheading in that chapter, he said, all my teachers were black. It's like, okay, that might help. That might be helpful. And so I'm looking at the beautiful article that Mama Ife wrote about him, and I'm reading and viewing the History Makers piece that Brother Larry Crow did with him, and it becomes readily apparent to me in that moment that for the first 30 years of Jacob Carruthers' life, it was just black people in his life, essentially. Black institutions, black schools, black churches, and a black family that has its roots in an all-black town in Texas. It was almost like the ancestors planned this from the beginning. Of course they did. Right? He was sent there to do what he did. It's very intentional. And so they made sure that all his teachers were black, and they made sure that in 6th grade that, okay, born in 1930, 6th grade is in year 11 or 12. So in the early 1940s, black teacher in Dallas, Darrell High School, introduces him to junior high school, I guess, introduces him to the Haitian Revolution. Really? 1940? All right. So what does it say about what we think about what was happening in these black institutions, these segregated institutions? Because I'm surprised. Why should I be surprised? Of course they learned about the Haitian Revolution at Darrell Junior High School in Dallas, because these are black teachers. And these are black teachers who belong to black churches. And these are black teachers who belong to black civic organizations. And these are black teachers who belong to black sororities and fraternities. And so, of course, they learned about the Haitian Revolution. Because one of the things that I've learned about our people is when institutions that are imposed upon us don't keep our memories, we will keep the memory. Which is why, in the wake of our institutions being attacked, eroded, losing support, I worry about what will happen to our memory in the future. Especially when our institutions are doing the eroding themselves. I'm thinking about my own institution right now. My employer, I should say. Because it feels less like a family in these moments. It feels less like a community in these moments. And so that impulse is driving this. And so just this semester, 2 students in my seminar wrote papers on Jacob Carruthers because we have this conversation in our classes. And they didn't take it to their other classes. And so I was shocked. This was shocking because last semester, 2 semesters ago, one of my colleagues out of the blue assigned intellectual warfare in their class. I'm like, wait, okay. I didn't know you knew. And then you started doing the digging. It's like, oh, there's some comment here. And previous to that, you know, and this is a thing about social media, which, you know, has its problems. I'm a big fan of talking about its problems, but there's also great things too, right? Because this scholar of the Haitian Revolution, black guy, who has Caribbean roots, has been teaching the Haitian Revolution for years. I offhandedly tweeted something about the irritated genie. He didn't even respond. He just went and read it. And then months later, he showed me his syllabus. The irritated genie is on the syllabus. Right? And so what I'm trying to figure out how to do is how to bring more of that kind of recovery of these types of moments and peoples into places where they may not even fit, but there are going to be students there that need to hear it, just like he needed to hear in 6th grade about the Haitian Revolution. Irritated genie don't fit in a graduate school curriculum, because the whole point of graduate school is to discipline you. Irritated genie is trying to break us out. He's trying to liberate us. Now, it does belong in the Black Studies graduate curriculum, and that's the difference. And why I went to Black Studies, because at least on paper, when I went to grad school, the idea was to liberate. And so the final person that I want to mention, that's also, she's not the final, because there's some other folk, but the final person that has a chapter devoted to them is Sylvia Winter, who was she's still with us. She's now 96, 95 or 96. With a very, very sharp mind. And the only reason I didn't interview her for this book is everybody's trying to interview her. I'm like, let me just not. Because part of what I think people forget, people do this with me all the time, and I'm only 36, is that you don't have to really talk to me because we left the books, we left the articles, we left the essays, we left the speeches. And I think people who are eager, I'm talking about younger grad students, to sort of do something or say something unique or new, a lot of them like to bypass all of the things that these elders have already written and said. They do it with Cedric Robinson too, right? And so they'll come to me because I wrote the biography, and they're like, well, show me the abolition syllabus. And I'm like, have you read the Terms of Order yet? And it's like, no. All right, go read, because part of, at least as scholars, what we have to figure out how to do is make study the center again. Because, you know, the elders in the room probably won't believe this, but there's at least one semi-recent graduate student here. And that is, we are not encouraged to read in graduate school. And so, this book is also in response to that. And how do you make study the center again? And so that's why another reason that the title is titled intentionally this title, because it is about study. For those who will now be in front of this generation of students, to stop this cycle of saying, you don't have to study everything, you don't have to read everything. These scholars read everything, and I'm definitely inspired by that. There was no, I don't have time to read this, or I don't think that this is relevant. There was none of that. You look at their footnotes, you look at Sylvia Winter's footnotes, you look at Jacob Carruthers' footnotes, you look at Cedric Robinson's footnotes. They only come to these conclusions because they study. Yes, they had the inspirations and the feeling and the influences from the blues and from black institutions, but they also had to study, right? They bring those two strands together, which is also us. And this is why Carruthers' work is so influential for me. Reading and writing is African too, right? If you go back to where we start, and it's not a contradiction to orality and to music and to song and to another one of my favorite ways of knowing, food ways and cooking, right? All of those things come together. right? And so Winter is widely cited and acknowledged, but underread. And so I think a lot of scholars think that they can bypass that by trying to get an interview with her, which to me, let this elder live her life. Anyway, in her early life, she was primarily a creative writer. She was born, about to get her year wrong, 1927. Yeah. Born in Cuba, in fact, because her parents were diplomats, I think. And she ends up in Jamaica 2 years later, Kingston. But she also spent a lot of time on the countryside in rural Jamaica, where she really begins to learn what she might call, the magic of black folk, right? The ability of people to make a way out of no way. We ain't got no money, we ain't got no food, but we're still gonna eat, right? Some of y'all know about that. I tell my students this all the time, because many of them are food insecure, or they know people who are food insecure. And I tell them, in parts of this country, there are black people who have the ability to know where to eat, regardless of whether or not they have money. But they know how to make that happen. And not just in this country, throughout the world, right? And I try to make this make sense to them, because a lot of them aren't from, like, where I'm from, which is like rural black America, right? I didn't think I was rural until I got to the city. It's like, okay, I'm definitely rural. Not farmland rural, right? I didn't have to, pick cotton or like my parents did. There were no chickens in my yard, but my grandparents had chickens, right? But all of my elders were on fixed income. None of them had what we might call the modern conveniences of life. But one thing that they mastered was how to feed themselves, regardless of any of that. And so it got so I guess the management people would say efficient, right? But that ain't the word I want to use. We were so invested in each other that the children ended up depending, in some cases, on the elders, despite the fact that the children had jobs, the children had some measure of stability, but they had to depend on the elders because the elders knew how to make a seed turn into a year's supply of fresh vegetables. They knew how to make one pig turn into a year's supply of non-processed meat. And so that knowledge has now skipped 2 or 3 generations. And that's also blues knowledge. Because we're going to catch L's from all kinds of corners, but we're still going to eat at the end of the day. And going to have enough food for the people who messed up and didn't do their job so they could eat too. Right? Mississippi is a great place to study this. In fact, I think part of what makes these sort of civil rights era so critical is that they begin to bring those values to the logic of like transformation of society. Like Fannie Lou Hamer got into farming after the cameras left. Right? That's what she did. Farming in terms of subsistence farming, not being a field hand or working for a commercial, right? And so these things, Sylvia Winter, and being in Jamaica, you can probably notice it better, particularly in the countryside. But she says these are the values that informed how I saw black people and black folk. So I never, from that moment, felt the compulsion to believe that we were inferior. Never had those psychological hang-ups, right? And simultaneously, in the city, they're organizing against colonial rule. And so she's getting both, right? She's getting self-determination, she's getting radicalism, direct action, all of the things are coming together. And by the time she emerges as a young woman, it becomes, well, how do I creatively tell stories about these people? Because the kind of narrative that, I just got finished trying to explain at that point didn't appear in novels. It didn't appear in plays. And so at the turn of the 50s, she starts to write. And into the 1960s, she starts to engage these things on a creative level. And then she says, all right, this is cool, but I gotta go deeper. And she goes deeper. She gets into questions of criticism. Because once we started writing like that, whether it was the George Lamings of the world, the Chinua Achebe's of the world, like Ayikwe Armas of the world, Bessie Head, once we started writing like that, the critics decided, well, we can't do anything with this. We can't find ourselves in it, right? And so she begins to think about, well, what would a black literary criticism look like? And that's when everything explodes for her. Because what is the point of literary criticism anyway? Then she gets into the question of, well, what is the point of philosophy anyway? All right. That's the point. The point was to nominate us as human and the rest of y'all as not. And that became her life's work after that. Guess where you can do that work at? Black Studies. The place that those students created became the only place that's hospitable to that conversation. And so, to round out this kind of quartet, Winter, Robinson, Carruthers could only consummate the breaks that they were making with Western thought in places that looked like Black Studies. Du Bois could only do so too, but he, of course, did not live to see the creation of Black Studies programs, and so he was marginalized within his institutions. He essentially lost funding when he decided to do what was Black Studies in the early 19-teens. And then they asked him nicely to retire on his second stint when he came back to Atlanta in 1934 and left in 1944. Of course, he's old. HBCUs had a forced retirement age. Like, we want nobody over 68 teaching. But the students are like, well, that's Dr. Du Bois. And so, as he was being asked to leave, guess what he had imagined? He says, every scholar at every HBCU should be involved in a intra-Black university consortium. I guess Black University Consortium that was dedicated to the study of Black life. Why are we not talking to each other? Why are we not working together? Why don't we have a plan? And so Du Bois didn't just ask that question. Sometimes we get off on asking the question. I wish we could. Du Bois got his team together, including a group of young social scientists like Ira D. Reed, really important social scientist who doesn't get a lot of play. And they put together a plan. And it's fascinating reading the archives on this, because I'm reading something from 1942 that's more organized than what HBCUs have ever been able to muster together since. And then they asked him to retire. Can you imagine? Of course you can. We're all black. And we work for institutions that don't value us, even the ones that are supposed to. And so they asked him to retire, and the plan evaporates with his leaving of Atlanta. But the idea remained in the soil. It remained in place for young scholars like an Ackland Lynch to pick it up. Young scholars like a James Turner to pick it up, right? And so they knew enough about this tradition to have something to teach when the students said, all right, it's time to kick the doors in. And so who appears on the first Black Studies syllabi? W.E.B. Du Bois. Not alone, there's others, right? He's using him as an example. But that's his relationship to that moment that I've been talking about in the late 1960s. Yes, there were critiques of certain elements of his work. Let's be very clear, right? But there was no wholesale dismissal. I think people need to understand the differences between the two, right? For instance, my students know two things about Du Bois, right? He wrote The Souls of Black Folk, right? All right. Double consciousness. It's like, yes, he did. Just read the rest of that book, though. And they also know the Talented Tenth, because in the ecosystem that they participate in, Du Bois is just an elitist, right? And so we start from there, and then we get to, well, how does he then end up on the Black Panther Party reading list? He's an elitist. And so that's a learning curve for many young students, right? Because, you know, there's a propensity for outright dismissal. And I wouldn't even say this if my students had not revealed this to me, because in one of my classes we read the autobiography of W.E.B. Du Bois, and initially the students, some of these students who believed in these other things about him, you don't want to read that. That's Du Bois. He's an elitist. And it's like, all right, take a deep breath, open the book, turn to page, chapter and verse, and it starts to slowly wean them away from the idea that you can know the complexities of this intellectual tradition because you saw a tweet one day. And so that's where Du Bois fits in. And so I'm looking at the time. We're going to talk for maybe about 5 more minutes, but I have to say something about the two women that bookend the book. So 4 chapters in the middle, and then bookended by June Jordan in the front, introduction, and then Toni Cade Bombara in the back. So Junie, I feel like I can call her that, but I probably shouldn't. I've been in her archives, and it's like, you're Junie now. Where do you start? I tend to start where I start my classes. You know, she wrote this really important article called Black Studies Bringing Back the Person, which I think, you know, you ever seen those, that company that will print your dissertation on a scarf or on an Afghan? It's kind of weird to do your dissertation, but we should do that with Black Studies Bringing Back the Person. Let's put it on, like, something like a cloth that people can just read it. Because this article, which of course I use in the epigraph to the book, the epigraph to the first chapter of the book, she claims in 1969 that part of what you have to realize when you are teaching Black students is that they are the sources. Sometimes we teach Black people as if they don't know anything and don't actually experience life, and as if they have no parents, as if they have no grandparents or no community. But the reality is, one Black student in a room is a whole community of people that are actually the sources for how you think about the Black experience. And so in 1969, when she's saying this, the idea is, well, this is not relevant, these courses aren't relevant, these peoples have never accomplished anything, they have no history, blah, 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 blah. And she says, all right, there's black students in this room, we are the primary sources of information. Don't go to the library, not yet. Start from the primary sources and then get there. And then you realize that we can actually have a better understanding in reading it and critique of what's in the library. But black people are the primary sources of information. We can be the authorities of our own lives. That's the litmus test when you read a book. Are black people the authority in this book? Are they junior partners in the story that's about them? You read a book about black power and all the sources are newspapers of white journalists. All right, that's nice, you know, but is that black power? And so this is what Jordan taught me initially, but I realized that there was so much more to her over the past several years. And she starts off in black studies, although she works formally as a poet, right? She starts off teaching black studies. And so too did Toni K. Bambara. And, you know, Bambara, who wrote stories, short stories and novels. If you've never read any of her short stories, please, 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 Gorilla My Love, make sure you have it in the bookstore.
Yes, sir.
That, and this is one of her collections, that's the one I would start people off with. She writes about black children. And she takes it a step further to assert, at least by implication, that black children are the authorities. You ever notice how you can't fool black children? What do you think about that for a second? Like, and how committed, especially the younger they are, to telling the truth as they see it. It might not be true, but it's the truth that they saw and experienced, right? And in talking to them, how they want to know if they don't know. And in fact, part of what I think the frustration is with the school system is it doesn't start from that premise with black kids. It starts from a different premise. All right, how do we get you to pass this test? Or how do we get you to control your behavior in this moment? You're talking too loud. And we don't know what to do with that. We don't know what to do with your human culture because it's not normative, right? And so when you read Gorilla My Love and other books by Toni K. Bambara, it's like, all right, this is how we should reframe how we think about and relate to even our children. Because when she was a child, and you know, somebody gonna feel some kind of way about this, but her mother would be cleaning the house. And if you're like me, when your mom is cleaning the house, you're either sitting quietly in the corner or you're cleaning the house too. Right? Those are the two options. But Toni would sit in the middle of the kitchen floor while her mom was mopping, reading a book. And her mom decided, let's see where this goes. And you see where it went. Toni K. became one of the most brilliant, not only writers, but theorists of black experience, particularly the question of how women might relate to other levers of struggle. Right? You read her article, the issue of roles, talking about the conversation that women are having about, well, what's the appropriate role for black women in the revolution, right? She talks about the relationship between writing and revolution, because clearly in the West, writers are the navel gazers. They are the people that sit up here and, you know, they just pontificate on things. And she says, black writers, you don't get to do that. In fact, the republication of a very important book by our allies, I guess, Haymarket Books, Black Women Writers at Work. You should have that here too. And you read Toni K.'s entry, how seriously she takes the vocation of writing. I couldn't not include that in this conversation because she ties that directly to the question of what black studies must be. Because she too got her start teaching in Black Studies. And so those are the people that sort of comprise this book. And if I were to write it again, I might choose 6 different, because there's so many in this tradition that deserve to be engaged in this way, because they've sacrificed so much for us, with us, of us. And so we have to be of them, and be so that we can be of we. So I'll stop there.
Oh my goodness. Round of applause. Wow. Oh my goodness. So much went through my head while you were speaking. You took me back to elementary school and how frustrating it was to, well, at the time I didn't have the words, you know, but the way you have articulated and given voice to those inner thoughts of just, why am I reading about the natives, you know, as if I am detached, you know, from that. I love how you give agency to us. I loved how you have an curiosity to reverse engineer how our giants came to their intellectual prominence. Thank you for building that out, for exploring that, for journeying that way, for just even having the interest to go down that road. Oh, this is so refreshing. I am going to now.
I must add, Anderson Thompson showed me this too. First time seeing Dr. Thompson talk, 2009, and he did, if you've seen this, you know, he did his old scrappers presentation, where he just goes all the way back to the beginning of the end of the 18th century, because he probably starts with Prince Hall, and brings it forward and says, all right, these are the people you need to know. And after an hour, there's like 35 new names that you got to go and research and realize, like, damn, we were doing all of that. Okay. Like, the first time I realized that the earliest example of a Black historical text written by a Black person was in like the early 1830s. I realized that there's a lot more that we have to sit down and read, because if we were writing that long, that long ago, right? And it's like, what were they saying? What could they say, right? If you were a Black scholar writing in the 1830s, trying to tell the story of our people. Anderson Thompson taught me how to think about people's lives as scholars in that way. And once I saw that in 2009, you know, I kept seeing it, right? In the way that Dr. Thompson talked about people, but also in what he wrote. And I suspect there's a lot more that he wrote that might see the light of day soon, because I know what we have that's extant is not even in the same region as what he was able to produce over the course of his life. So I wanted to say that since we mentioned Carruthers, we got to mention Thompson.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
The Twin Towers. Okay. I am going to see, right, if there's any questions from our we don't have any online. Well, I do need to check Facebook to see there's some engagement on Facebook. But I definitely want to invite you, see if anyone has any questions at this time. I'm going to send the mic around so that it can be heard. If you don't want to be on camera, you'll have to let me know. Okay. But at least your question will be heard by the generations. Is there anyone? Questions? Comments? Questions? Not yet. Okay, hold on. Can you send that around, please? You just have to turn the switch on.
Is there a place for me to plug? Is it that long? Is it far?
It's right here. That's important.
since we're letting the circle be unbroken.
Hey, Brother Safari.
What's going on, Josh? It is so odd to speak with a microphone in such close quarters, and it's good. Hello, everyone. Apologies for being tardy. Coming from the far south side over here in traffic was a thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, just wanted to say one, hey Josh, good to see you. So glad to see
You,
you.
brother.
And just want to extend some deep, some deep gratitude for kind of, as Sister was saying a touch earlier about like operating from a space of presuming, like we don't have to get to the work of trusting ourselves. We already do. We don't have to get to the space of discovering if what we're thinking about is the right thing. We already are. And thinking about something that a colleague and friend of ours, Dr. Jared Ball, talks about in a different context of like, in this context, like what I love about this work is how do our folks navigate dealing with the consequences of our correctness in a temporary social epoch that tries to reject and annihilate any streams of resistance. And so as someone that didn't go through the academy, I've always been intrigued by reading this work kind of like as an outsider in that direction, but as an insider in terms of the long work of our people. And just have, like the way that I describe this work when I'm talking to other people is like, like Josh sees black people like I see black people. And so I just want to say that public, like, thank you for that. For choosing to be with us, choosing to study us, choosing to be in community with us. And I'm glad that these two were in the car, thumbing through your book, because I'm not waiting for a specific time for them to get into a space, because this is what should be our regular.
Right.
And so, no comment, no questions at the time. I'm sure I have some, but I don't want to hold all the time. But,
now, what you said about trust is actually where we begin. So you're already aligned, again, trusting ourselves, right? But, before you got here, Zinga was telling the story about how this event came to be, and she says, well, I usually have a process of vetting the books and making sure that and then she said, no, but I trusted Muriel and, the Comedic Institute, right? And so, no need to vet. Just come on. But I promise you, if I would have said something that was off, there would have been a correction or something. Like, no, sir. No.
We would have worked it out.
Yeah.
The views and opinions on this program, though. Just kidding.
So yeah, I just want to shout you out, Safari, too. I met Safari virtually. I guess we were still inside, right? It was still pandemic era.
Era. I love that.
Yeah. Well, inside. Well, we are in pandemic era, but there was an inside version of pandemic era, a lockdown version. And I think it was my brother Anyabwile Love.
I was just thinking about it.
Who suggested your photography to be featured in our journal, Gathering Together. He showed me some of the shots, and I'm like, yo, of course. And I think the initial shots that I saw were taken in the city. And so there's something to black people in Chicago. It's really something.
It's true.
English doesn't even capture the essence of the beauty of black Chicago. But Safari's photographs do. Like, yeah. And so we did feature him in our journal. And then, make sure y'all follow him and stuff. And then, when you told me what a book trailer was, I went on my IG and like, anybody know how to do a book trailer? And then Safari's like, yeah, I'll do it. Didn't charge a single cent. He said, I'll just do it as an act of service to this event and to this community. And so anybody that saw that trailer, that was Safari's handiwork.
Wow.
So Nzinga loved it.
I loved it, yes. The
So thank
music,
you.
oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Any other comments? Questions? Maybe nobody wants to. Everybody's shy of the mic.
The echo. The echo.
The echo. And I turned the echo down. Lisa's working, okay. Oh,
I don't
gosh.
know Mike, but I just want to know what was the process of getting the book published? You said that,
Yeah.
who's the publisher? I just played on, but I'm not familiar with it. How did you end up getting this into print?
Thank you. That's a great question. I
Please
think.
repeat the question.
So the question is, how did this end up getting into print? What was the process in relationship to who the publisher is, Pluto? This is a significant question because when you try to make a claim for and of Black people, it don't translate all the time to people that dominate publishing, which is not Black people.
Correct.
And so, obviously, I would have loved to have placed this at a Black publisher. But the market being what it just doesn't always work. And so Black Classic Press was the first press to have access to this. And the market conditions just weren't conducive to them. And in fact, they had it 8 years ago. And it's, in its proposal stage because it wasn't written yet. But that was where I wanted it because, Paul Coates, owner of Black Classic Press, founder of Black Classic Press, was very important to republishing books that are significant to this tradition that made me. Not only just republishing and then publishing people like Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben as well. In fact, he's the principal publisher of Dr. Ben's works. And so, publishing works like African Life and Customs by Edward Mike Blyden, When Africa Awakes, Hubert Harry Harrison, these books that, that just fell from the lips of Dr. Carruthers and Dr. Thompson all the time. Paul Coates was listening and then publishing them. Hence the name Black Classic Press, right? So I really wanted it to be there. But then I think I got distracted, is not the right word, but I went around this work to publish the other two books. And the publishers, my first publisher was like, all right, we want your next book. And so I sent it to them, and it just wasn't a match. They didn't understand what was happening. They could understand something about protest, which was my first book, right? They didn't really get what was happening here. And so, as late as 2018, actually, 2019, I didn't have a publisher in 2019. And I'm steady working on it, right? Because, push come to shove, I'll just put it on a PDF and like, here's the book. But as I'm doing it, so Badura Lagra becomes the co-editor of the Black Critique series at Pluto Press, and she's a Black Studies scholar. She got her PhD in Black Studies, and Anthony Bogues, who was her mentor, is the other co-editor of this particular volume. This cat's from Jamaica, wrote about Black intellectual traditions. This book called Black Heretics is really important, and I just learned about how quietly he was one of the most significant authorities on like Black intellectual traditions in a very quiet, very, very quiet way. And so those two, I felt extremely comfortable working with, despite the fact that this was a white publisher. They basically dominated what got pushed in this particular series. And so you look at the other books in this series, Thomas Sankara, Malcolm X, Ande. You gotta have that book in. It's called The Point Is to Change the World by Ande. From Grenada. I'm sorry, not from Grenada, from Guyana. And they're going to be doing a Fred Hampton book. I probably should not announce that, but I'm in Chicago.
We didn't hear it.
Fred Hampton wrote stuff, y'all.
What?
And so they're going to be publishing his writings.
Thank you.
And so this is the kind of imprint, right?
Wow.
Where I felt comfortable.
Yeah, I see.
And it's in alignment with what Safari said earlier. once Badur saw the proposal, I didn't have to explain anything to her. Right? I didn't have to, well, why is the title this way, and why did you include? She got it she got it immediately. And as a writer, navigating the process of finding someone to publish work and to, it's nerve-wracking when you spend all this time trying to frame something and you then still have to explain it in a follow-up email. It's like, didn't you read? With Badur, it was, all right, I get it. Let me just go ahead and put this through because we're publishing this book. And once that is lifted, once you have a home for the text, and once you know that home is not going to be a place where I have to minimize or traduce the tradition, it was easy. It was easy after that. The only thing I fought them on was the cover, because the original cover was not this. And so I had to get my cosmogram in there. Like, no, we're going to do this. This is about spirituality. This is African people. Like, you're going to put the cosmogram in there. It's going to be subtle, so we got to know it's a cosmogram. So it's also going to be interesting, too. But we're going to get this in here because I'm not going to have a cover that doesn't represent who African people are. And so we're going to either have some figures or we're going to have some abstraction. But it's going to be African. So that's what happened with the cover. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I could really start all my lectures with the cover because it's the Dakinga or the Kikongo cosmogram in various formations, various cycles. So each color represents one cycle of your life. And we all experience life as a cycle. So you're an elder, right? You're a child, you're mature, then you're unborn, right? All of those things. And so that was the only real fight with the publisher, and that had nothing to do with Badur and Tony. It was just a matter of, all right, y'all know we gotta do something meaningful, right? All right. So if you actually did a deep dive on this book, you can probably still see the original cover. Like, you can see why I chose this one. But yeah, that was the only real trouble publishing. I think, what I love about Pluto is they were very systematic in terms of, because I had really anxiety about like copy editing. Because I know there are like tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of mistakes. And we didn't even catch all of them, but we caught the ones that would have embarrassed me because they did 3 rounds of copy editing. And one thing about self-publishing, you don't get that unless you got money. And even academic publishing, you don't get 1 round unless you got money. They did 3 rounds, which is great. The other thing that I would say is that Zed Press, which published Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, has some relationship to Pluto, and that's the other way that I kind of felt at home with this particular press. They're based in London, so that presented some challenges. I had to email them at certain times because they wouldn't see it, but I did love that, I think I signed the contract on July 4th. They sent it because, they were at work over there. It's like, all right, I feel you because I ain't celebrating either. Like, so that was cool. But yeah, they do radical publishing. And so at some point I'm going to be in London because Black folk in London are reading this as well, because that's where the publisher is based. So it's a little bit of context.
Yeah, excellent question. The book industry is a lot more than meets the eye, and I'm thankful that you held your ground about the cover, because I have heard so many stories from authors about that very thing.
It's the biggest fight right now.
It's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's like, yeah, we're not supposed to judge a book by a cover, but the cover sells, okay? The cover definitely sells.
And here's what I think happens, and this is anybody that wants to be an author, they don't figure it out, the algorithm for which ones sell. And so it's not even only like artists who are like, it's like, okay, what colors, what fonts fit the algorithm? And they come up with all these models and stuff, and so they know what colors sell better on Amazon. Right? They know what fonts sell better on Amazon. They're not producing covers for stores anymore. They're producing covers for the digital space in many ways. So that's another thing that you have to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. One more time asking for questions. I don't see any questions on Facebook, and I want to make sure to give each of you an opportunity to speak with Brother Myers after the event. So I think we will go ahead and close things out. I'm so happy that you all joined us today, and you tolerated this multimedia like experience, and I'm just on a cloud.
We're like podcast bros with our mics and tables.
Exactly. Exactly. Working it out. Please support this brother. This means so much when you're if you're able to purchase a copy of the author's book. It just goes a long way in supporting our intellectual resources, which is a very valuable resource indeed. Any closing remarks? Something you just thought of you wanted to share before we? Let me make sure to thank my staff. By the way, let me give in case my staff can't hear me, I want to thank you. Susan Dew, Kayla Dillingham, thank you so much. I would not be able to have sat here this whole time without you. Okay.
So how do people who want to buy from Afriware get the book? You should say that.
Oh,
word.
yes, online. Okay,
Yes.
so my online audience, we have plenty of copies in store of I have to keep remembering to say it, of Black Studies. It is $26.95 online or in store. Just go to afriwarebooks.com, and in the search bar you can type in Of Black Study or Joshua Myers. Either one will pull up the book. Thank you.
Yes.
Your check's in the mail.
'Cause I don't know what Piles has to say.
Oh, and if you want to follow Joshua, what is your
Instagram
your handles and all that?
is Comedics, I guess not comedic, but English spelling of Jehudi.
Okay.
DDHEWTY on Instagram, and that's pretty much all I do now, I think.
DDHEWTY.
DDHEWTY.
Okay, look him up. Follow him. Yes. Any further? Yes.
I just want to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Follow the tradition, and I appreciate that. There's some people I never heard of, the winter, Sandra.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the other dream I had.
Mhm.
But follow the tradition, and we need to have people know, especially students, older people like myself, or anybody,
Mhm.
follow this line. Try to understand where we are, where we come from, where we are.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you.
That means a lot coming from you because of your work with Baba, Jetty, Jacob Carruthers. So I don't know if people heard that online, but
Please repeat.
Well, I can't repeat all of that.
Okay, right.
But
Paraphrase.
our sister Carol, who worked with Jacob Carruthers, was thanking me for the presentation.
Very nice. Very nice. Any other housekeeping? Everybody's cool, calm? Oh, one more. Okay.
You talked about trust.
Yes.
I think that's a vital component for connecting us as a people. I heard the other day that trust was a real important component of the police, Chicago Police Department, reducing crime if they had a greater sense of trust in the people that they're supposed to be protecting. And trust is a vital component of life to me, period. Trust in family, trust in community, trust in those that you don't even know that look like you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so appreciate all the people that you mentioned, Anderson, Thompson, Jacob, Carruthers.
Thank
And
you.
I'm just excited to read your book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
When the great singer Rance Allen made his transition at the end of, it was the end of 2020, I believe, I wrote about trust in relationship to him. There's this moment where he and Twinkie Clark like sang "Trust in Him" on video, and it just sent me wherever it was where they got that thing from. What do you want to call it, a gift or whatever it is. And trusting in that sense was also important to how he was able to bring spirit into that moment, because at the beginning of the video he's reading the lyrics from sheet music because he clearly doesn't know them. And as the spirit began to ascend or descend, he just tosses the sheet music away, and there's this explosion of spirit that just takes everybody out. And it just reminded me of so many different like African ritual practices, and the fact that they were singing a song called "Trust in Him." It was like, yeah, we can put this on a piece of paper for you to learn and master, but that ain't how the spirit show up. And so when I wrote about it, I started to realize that we kind of do this every time we sing a song with trust in Him. Like, song like Richard Smallwood's "Trust Me." It's like the same thing is happening. There's a Robert Glasper and Marsha Ambrosius song called "Trust," and it's like the same thing is happening. John P. Key, the same thing is happening. What is this word "trust" doing to black people? And so I thought about that when you raised it again, and then when Tafari raised it, it's like, all right, something's happening here about the word trust. Even in this moment, we were feeling the same spirit that Rance Allen must have felt in that moment. So that's on my blog, by the way.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Love it, love it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all again for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you for making the trip out here. We know you could have been quarantined in your homes during the pandemic era, but you chose to come out. Thank you so much. Again, copies can be purchased on the other side of this wall by the great Susan or Kayla. Any final anything? Everybody's cool? Thank you. We officially. Oh, one last.
If there's something that you heard that you like, share it with 3 people in your life.
There you go. Yes. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Thank you.
you all.
Round of applause. Very good.
Everything works out.
Thank you so much. Indeed. And we have it recorded for future YouTube experience. Yes, yes.
Oh, you're
I
like,
think I would want the Zoom recording, even though we have it.
Sure, once it does its thing, it
Yeah, we
takes
have
a
it on
while.
Facebook too.
We're planning to go back to
Yeah.
Really?
Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. You as well.
Thank you so much.
We'll be back.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Where can I get a copy of the Salute to Black Presenters?
Oh, we have them. Yeah, we have them.
Are we still live? I think we're still live.
Oh, okay. Bye.